For 10 years, Kirk Hammett mourned a loss that most people can't comprehend. In 2014, his collection of over 250 vintage guitars, worth more than $20 million and accumulated over 3 decades, was stolen. Gone were guitars played by legends, irreplaceable pieces of music history, instruments he'd spent his life hunting down and preserving. The trail went cold. The guitars seemed lost forever. Then, in 2024, an anonymous tip led FBI agents to a compound in Mexico. They found 240 of the 250 guitars, and they found something else, evidence that the theft had been orchestrated by someone Kirk had once considered family. To understand what Kirk Hammett lost in 2014, you need to know what those guitars meant to him. Kirk Hammett joined Metallica in 1983 when he was just 20 years old, replacing the band's original lead guitarist. From the beginning, Kirk was obsessed with guitars, not just playing them, but collecting them, studying them, preserving them as artifacts of musical history. Unlike many rock stars who collected guitars as status symbols, Kirk approached it with the passion of a historian and the dedication of a curator. He didn't just want famous guitars, he wanted guitars that told stories, instruments that had shaped the sound of rock and blues, pieces that connected him to the lineage of guitar players who'd inspired him. His first major acquisition came in the late 1980s when he purchased a 1959 Gibson Les Paul, one of the most sought-after guitars in the world. That purchase ignited a passion that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, as Metallica's success gave him the financial means to pursue serious collecting, Kirk built one of the most impressive private guitar collections in the world. He acquired instruments that had belonged to blues legends like Peter Green and Michael Bloomfield. He found rare prototypes and one-of-a-kind custom builds. He tracked down guitars with documented history and provenance. Some of his prized possessions included a guitar that had belonged to Jimi Hendrix, several instruments played by blues masters, early prototypes of iconic guitar models, and rare vintage pieces from manufacturers who no longer existed. The collection represented not just monetary value, but cultural and historical significance. Kirk didn't keep the collection locked away. He regularly loaned guitars to museums for exhibitions. He used some of them in Metallica recordings and performances, believing that guitars should be played, not just preserved. He wrote articles about guitar history and shared his knowledge with other collectors and music historians. By 2014, his collection had grown to over 250 instruments, with a total estimated value exceeding $20 million. It was the result of 30 years of careful acquisition, authentication, restoration, and preservation. It was his life's work outside of Metallica. In early 2014, Kirk decided to move his collection to a new storage facility that offered better climate control and security. This kind of move wasn't unusual for serious collectors. Vintage guitars require specific environmental conditions to remain in optimal condition, and upgrading storage is part of responsible preservation. Kirk contracted with a moving and storage company that specialized in handling valuable items. The company had good references and experience with high-value collections. They understood the delicate nature of vintage instruments and the security requirements involved. The move was scheduled for February 2014. Kirk provided detailed instructions about how each guitar should be packed, what environmental conditions needed to be maintained during transport, and security protocols for the move. He trusted the professionals to handle his life's work with the care it deserved. On the day of the move, Kirk wasn't present. He was traveling with Metallica for tour commitments. He'd arranged for the moving company to pack everything under supervision and transport the collection to the new facility. Everything seemed routine. Then the collection vanished. At first, there was confusion about exactly what had happened. The moving company claimed they'd delivered everything to the storage facility as contracted. The storage facility had no record of receiving the shipment. Phone calls led to more confusion, then to alarm, then to the horrifying realization that 250 guitars, worth more than $20 million, had disappeared.
Kirk was devastated. The monetary value was staggering, but the personal loss went far deeper. These weren't just expensive instruments, they were pieces he'd hunted down over decades. They were guitars he'd played, studied, loved. They were his connection to music history and to the guitarists who'd inspired him. The investigation began immediately. Police were called, insurance companies got involved, private investigators were hired. But the trail was confusing and contradictory. The moving company insisted they'd fulfilled their contract. Documents were produced, but they didn't match reality. It became clear that something had gone very wrong, possibly criminal. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. The theft hadn't been a random crime of opportunity. It had been planned. Someone had known exactly what was in that collection, when it was being moved, and how to make it disappear. Evidence began pointing to an inside job. Someone with knowledge of Kirk's collection, his schedule, and the details of the move had orchestrated the theft. But who? The investigation revealed that a former Metallica crew member, someone who'd worked with the band in the 1990s and early 2000s, had been involved in planning the theft. This person had maintained connections with current crew members and had access to information about Kirk's personal affairs, including the guitar collection and the planned move. The betrayal cut deep. This wasn't a stranger who'd stolen from Kirk. This was someone who'd been part of the Metallica family, someone who'd traveled with the band, worked alongside them, shared meals and conversations, someone Kirk had trusted. But even with this knowledge, the guitars remained missing. Leads went nowhere. The former crew member denied involvement. Without the physical evidence of the guitars themselves, prosecuting anyone was nearly impossible. Years passed. The insurance claim was settled, though no amount of money could replace the historical significance of what had been lost. Kirk tried to move forward, but the loss haunted him. He'd occasionally see a guitar in a shop or at an auction that reminded him of pieces from his collection, and the grief would return fresh. He stopped collecting seriously after the theft. The joy had been tainted by betrayal. He still played guitar, still performed with Metallica, but the passionate pursuit of vintage instruments that had defined his personal life for 3 decades was essentially over. By 2024, the case was effectively cold. A decade had passed. Kirk had largely given up hope of ever seeing his collection again. Stolen guitars this valuable, if they'd been sold, would be scattered across the world by now, impossible to trace. Then, in March 2024, the FBI received an anonymous tip. The tip claimed that a large collection of vintage guitars was being stored at a compound in Mexico, just south of the border from California. The tipster provided specific details about the location and suggested the guitars might be connected to a 2014 theft in the United States. FBI agents working with Mexican authorities investigated the tip. What they found was extraordinary: a temperature-controlled facility containing hundreds of vintage guitars, carefully stored and preserved. Many of the instruments matched descriptions from Kirk Hammett's stolen collection. A coordinated raid was executed. The compound was secured. Experts were brought in to examine and authenticate the instruments. One by one, guitars were identified and matched to Kirk's collection documentation. Serial numbers, unique characteristics, provenance records, everything checked out. Of Kirk's 250 stolen guitars, 240 were recovered. 10 remained missing, their fate unknown. Kirk received the call from the FBI in April 2024. His collection had been found. After 10 years, the guitars were coming home. The reunion was overwhelming. Kirk traveled to the FBI facility where the guitars were being held as evidence. Walking into the secure room where they were stored, he was hit with a wave of emotion he hadn't anticipated. Seeing them again after a decade, instruments he'd thought were lost forever, was like greeting old friends he'd believed were dead. He approached the first guitar slowly, almost afraid to touch it. A 1959 Les Paul that had been one of his earliest major acquisitions. He picked it up carefully, feeling its familiar weight, running his fingers along the neck that he'd played countless times. The guitar felt the same, but everything else had changed. Some of the guitars looked exactly as they had the day they were stolen, preserved perfectly in the climate-controlled Mexican facility. Others showed minor wear, slight scratches, slight changes in string height, evidence that someone had played them over the years. The thought of the thieves playing his instruments, making music with stolen pieces.
But the joy was complicated by the circumstances. These guitars had been stolen by someone he'd trusted. They'd been hidden away for a decade, kept from museums and historians who could have benefited from studying them. And 10 guitars were still missing, likely sold off early in the theft, now in private collections, or perhaps even destroyed. The investigation into who had orchestrated the theft and where the guitars had been for 10 years continued. Evidence suggested that the former crew member had worked with associates to steal the collection, then had hidden it in Mexico, waiting for attention on the case to die down before attempting to sell the instruments. But the plan had failed. Either conscience or fear had prompted someone, possibly someone else involved in the theft, to tip off the FBI anonymously. The guitars had been recovered before they could be dispersed into the collector market, where they'd have been lost forever. Kirk chose not to speak publicly in detail about who had betrayed him. "Someone I trusted," was all he would say. "That hurts more than losing the guitars." He didn't want to give more attention to the person who'd caused him so much pain. The legal proceedings continued. Charges were filed. The case made headlines in the music world and among guitar collectors. Stories emerged about the decade the guitars had spent hidden away, preserved but unused, their historical and musical value locked away from the world. Kirk faced a decision about what to do with the recovered collection. The theft and recovery had changed his relationship with the guitars. They were no longer just instruments to him. They were evidence of betrayal, symbols of loss and recovery. He decided to loan a significant portion of the collection to musical museums around the world. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York received several blues instruments. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame got guitars with documented rock history. Museums in Europe and Asia received pieces relevant to their local musical heritage. If these guitars had been stolen from him once, he reasoned, at least now they could serve a greater purpose, educating people about music history, inspiring young guitarists who might never see such instruments otherwise, preserving the legacy of the blues and rock masters who'd originally played them. The theft had taught him that private ownership, no matter how careful, couldn't ultimately protect these pieces. Public institutions, with their security and preservation expertise, could keep them safer and make them accessible to millions.